Hello and welcome to the Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series. My name is Andy Erickson. I'm so excited to welcome you to the seminar and introduce our speaker. I do want to acknowledge, though, that our seminar series is funded through the University of Minnesota Water Resources Center, the Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment, the Clean Water Council of Minnesota, in partnership with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and hosted right here at St. Anthony Falls Laboratory. We're so excited to have you here for this. For those of you who are online, please use the Q&A function within Zoom to ask your questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions anytime during the presentation or the panel. For those in the room, when we get to our Q&A, just raise your hands and we'll ask your questions. I'm excited about today's seminar. The title for this month's keynote presentation is called Moving Towards Multifunction Stormwater Management Systems. We'll start with a keynote presentation by our invited speaker, and then we will have a panel discussion to include 3 local experts as part of the discussion. And the purpose here is to answer your questions, so get your questions ready as we move through the program. But now it's my honor to introduce this month's keynote speaker. Lauren McPhillips is an assistant professor co-appointed in the departments of Civil and Environmental Engineering and in Agricultural and Biological Engineering at Penn State University. Now, something that's very interesting about Lauren is she loves to bike. She doesn't get to bike nearly as much anymore with her current responsibilities. It seems, if you read any of her scholarly papers, she's doing almost everything. So she's doing a lot of things, but she does get to bike, and she's been able to bring that into her research. She actually has a research bicycle, if you can imagine it, and she can fit 2 full carousels of ISCO bottles with this research bike. So she's been able to work it into her monitoring field research, bicycling as well, although I think mostly the students get to ride the bike. Is that true? You get a little bit of the fun, so that's good. So that's exciting. That's a little something about Lauren. But without any further ado, it's my pleasure to turn the screen over to Lauren for our keynote presentation and to get our Minnesota Stormwater Seminar underway. Lauren, please.
All right, thank you so much, Andy. All right, thank you so much for having me here today. So I do a lot of work more on the traditional hydrology and biogeochemistry side and urban systems and ecologically engineered infrastructure, but part of the reason I get really excited about green stormwater infrastructure, and I think a lot of other people are, is a lot of these other potential benefits in these systems, and that's what I want to spend more time talking to you about today. There we go. Okay. So I want to make sure we're on the same page here, as I already maybe threw out one acronym there. So a lot of you are probably familiar with some of these acronyms, but 2 of the things I'll be talking about today are these concepts of green stormwater infrastructure and stormwater control measures. We have so many different terminologies out there. I want to make sure that we're clear on what I'm talking about. So I like to think about this ecological, the technological, or green to gray spectrum. Or on the far left side, we have these sort of intact ecological features that can provide us some really important services that we can, motivate us to protect and conserve these spaces. But a lot of what I'm talking about today is these more hybrid, semi-engineered features that have some vegetation and soil components providing these biological based services. And then these are all under this umbrella of green stormwater infrastructure, with those just being a couple examples. And on the far right, these more gray solutions that are also very important for some of our stormwater functions, but I won't be focusing on as much on those today, but they're all that, along with GSI, under this bigger umbrella of stormwater control measures, or SCM. So 2 acronyms that you might see. So as I'm sure you've heard in many other seminars through this series, we're accruing lots of good information on the sort of hydrologic and water quality benefits of these different types of stormwater control measures. And so here we see some examples pulled out of the International BMP database, where all these different letters that we see on the bottoms of these 2 plots. On the left, this one is focused on runoff volume reduction. On the right is focused on total nitrogen or water quality function. We can see with these plots, these different types of GSI features have different levels of performance. So this is important information as we think about, well, if we want to prioritize runoff reduction volume, this can help us inform what type of features that we're picking, like the infiltration-based permeable pavement or bioretention that are some of the highest reductions there. But one of the key reasons that people get excited about GSI, not just me, but a lot of others, is the mic? Oh, we're good. Okay. Is there potential to provide other benefits as well? So my colleague at UNC Charlotte, Fuchsia Ann Hoover, has done some really cool work mining city plans across the US. I'm sure with a lot of practitioners here, some of you are probably involved in writing some of these city plans. And when we look at the motivations around green stormwater infrastructure specifically, why are we using that versus some of these other more gray solutions? A lot of this is justified based on the multifunctionality. So of course, the hydrologic goals are up there because that's our regulatory motivator, but it's explicitly stated in a lot of these plans that the expectation of social benefits and other ecosystem services is a big motivator. So what other benefits am I talking about here? So we see an example sort of rain garden bioretention sort of feature here. So we see those hydrologic and water quality benefits, but then we're thinking about things like heat mitigation. So you're probably familiar with this phenomenon that we're dealing with a lot in urban areas where all these hard infrastructures that we've built are really good at absorbing heat. And so especially as we get into summer, I know in Minnesota and in Pennsylvania, this is probably not the first thing on our minds to think about heat mitigation, but as we deal with some changing temperatures with climate change and we have these hotter summer days, we think about the downtown urban cores of our old cities that are very dominated by lots of hard features that do an excellent job at holding on to heat. This is a service that we need to think more about. Then we have things like habitat provisioning. So here we see, with a rain garden, we're thinking a lot about pollinators and birds. I know as part of our panelists, I think we'll have one person, from more of a fisheries perspective. And as we think about other types of green stormwater infrastructure, like wet basins or wet ponds, we can think more about aquatic-based organisms and what organisms might be, creating habitat in some of these types of environments. On the social side, we're thinking about, this kind of umbrella of benefits that are somewhat focused on the aesthetic perceptions, but there's also things like recreation and other social benefits. Something I like thinking a lot about as a biogeochemist is the potential for carbon sequestration in these features. So as we're building features to deal with resilience, also thinking about the potential benefits of having a reduced carbon footprint or active carbon uptake in these systems. So these are just a couple examples of the benefits that we're thinking about. But the thing is that a lot of the existing work out there is not really focusing in on some of these benefits that we're interested in that we call cultural or supporting services. You can see those listed out on the left, kind of what benefits fall under those categories. These are these biodiversity and habitat provision and social benefits. And a lot of these studies that are out there are not often measuring more than one of these services at once. And so this leads me to some of the guiding questions for what I'm talking about today, which is thinking about what types of stormwater control measures are being implemented and what are these implications for provided services. And to answer this, we also need to be better quantifying the types and magnitudes of ecosystem services actually being provided and connecting them to different SEM types, or at least their characteristics that lead to that service provision. So I want to start by talking a little bit about some insights on the types of SEMs that are being implemented in different cities. And some of this in a few slides will look a little bit familiar to some things you heard about from Dr. Bhaskar last month. If we start to dig into the types of green stormwater infrastructure that are being implemented, we can start to detect some shifts in time of priorities and function. So I did some work with Baltimore where we were looking at some of the data they had on all the different types of SEMs that they were implementing over time. And so what this plot is showing is the density, the number of features per area in the city, and the year that they were constructed. The green colors represent basins or ponds, so structures that were more focused on peak flow mitigation. The structures that are more orange colored are underground features. Blue filters are things that includes biofiltration and rain garden type features. So if we look at changes over time here, we see in the late 80s to early 2000s, it's mostly basins and ponds that are super prevalent. But then we hit this point around 2000 where we have this very drastic transition happening in Baltimore. And if we look at the sort of change in the policy space, this is where we're starting. They passed the State Stormwater Act. They had a new design guidance coming out that was prioritizing water quality more, but also thinking about the potential for these other benefits. And so we see more of these, prevalence of bioretention sort of facilities, also underground facilities dealing with some of the constraints of the urban environment, but more green roofs, rain gardens, and a more diverse range of features being implemented. We see evidence actually that the size of features was changing. So on the top plot, you can see that the average size of the facility was actually decreasing, showing this emphasis on more decentralized stormwater management, which was motivated a lot by the idea of trying to mimic pre-development hydrology better, but it also has implications for accessibility of ecosystem services. Because if we look at the bottom plot, even though we had smaller features going in, we still had comparable area of features going in, meaning that we're putting in more smaller features. So theoretically, there's less distance to any given green infrastructure feature. A couple of these images will look a little bit familiar from last month, but I'm going to kind of leverage these in a different direction than Aditi did last time. And so I want to talk a little bit about some national scale work that we did looking at some different assemblages of stormwater control measures in cities across the US. And so I had been working with a few cities, and a bunch of colleagues had been working with other cities and had insights on their stormwater control measures. And so we all came together to kind of understand better about what types of features were being implemented and why. And so if we look at the density of features being implemented, we see those blue bars there as by far some of the cities with the highest density of stormwater control measures. And those cities are these cities that have combined sewer overflow consent decrees. And so requiring economic, the economic incentive to be, or requirement to be implementing stormwater management is having them put all these resources into, these cities are deciding that not just going with gray solutions, but they're going to put some of their resources towards green stormwater infrastructure as well. And so it's motivating massive implementation. And, by not choosing wholly gray solutions, they're, inherently prioritizing some of these potential co-benefits. And then we can look at the types of features being implemented. And so all these different colors, again, represent these different types of stormwater controls, where over on the furthest right side, we actually see Baltimore showing up again. And Baltimore is actually the city here with the greatest diversity of different types of features. And so we can think about, what does this mean for the provision of different types of ecosystem services? On the far left, we see Pocatello, Idaho there with a completely green column. In a lot of these Western cities, they're really prioritizing infiltration. They really want groundwater recharge, and so that's what they want to focus on. And so, we can see these priorities coming out with these different types of motivations in the types of stormwater controls implemented. So now I want to start connecting into, with these different types of features and the associated characteristics, what might be some of the types and magnitudes of services that we could expect. So I'm going to shift to talk about some field research that we've been doing in Pennsylvania, primarily in the city of Lancaster is what I'll be leveraging here. So why Lancaster? Well, it's a CSO city. And so they've decided as part of their consent decree that a big way they were going to meet their stormwater volume reductions was through leveraging green stormwater infrastructure. They're a small city, a very old city. And as we can see in this map up here with the red and the gray, there is not a lot of green in their downtown. There's a lot of roads and buildings and a lot of urban heat island challenges and a lot of runoff generation. And so they decided to prioritize implementation of green stormwater infrastructure features, including over 140 bioinfiltration features, which they refer to as rain gardens. So we originally had hoped to compare some different types of GSI, but here we actually focused more specifically on mostly these bioinfiltration features, which actually had a decent variability in the type of vegetation present and the ages, and we thought those would be some interesting variables to explore. So we see a couple examples here, and we'll dig more into things like the vegetation composition in a little bit. These are mostly features in the right-of-way, sometimes placed in parks. And we also, depending on the type of measurement, we're also using some additional reference sites, either turf grass or pavement, depending on the type of measurement we were making. So some of the services we were trying to collect some data on included things like heat mitigation. Again, old, densely developed city. This is a concern downtown for thinking about how we can mitigate some of those effects. We looked at metals retention as a proxy for water quality improvement, and I'll talk more about the specific methods in a second. We did some measurements of infiltration as a proxy for runoff reduction. We also looked at vegetation diversity, as well as carbon mitigation and aesthetic and social benefit. So heat mitigation, this is one that has not really been studied a lot with respect to green stormwater infrastructure. I know there's some cool work going on here at University of Minnesota, starting to understand some of the roles of urban trees and vegetation and in green infrastructure, and I think we need certainly more work going on in this space. So I did a postdoc research position in Arizona where heat is very much on everyone's minds there. And there's folks from the biometeorology space that are thinking a lot about the thermal comfort of humans. So how does, the whole surroundings, the air temperature, but also that long wave radiation coming off the pavement, how does that affect how a human feels and is experiencing the conditions? And so, I learned a bit about some of their methodology, and there's some very complex radiometers that you can get, which are allow you to make some really excellent measurements of the different types of radiation being emitted, but they're also pretty bulky and costly. And so we were kind of trying to balance some cost efficiency here and portability, and went for this particular set of sensors that's referred to as the Kestrel Heat Stress Tracker. One of the key things to note there, so you see Christina there on the top left with one, and you see that black globe there. That's a globe thermometer, which is like a metal ball around a thermistor. And it's one way of getting information about the long wave radiation that's being emitted. And there's also an air temperature thermometer there. We're also getting some wind speed and humidity information. And so we're placing this on a tripod and actually putting it in different locations. So there we see it on the tripod. And then we're putting it in different locations relative to our green infrastructure features. In the green infrastructure, which of course we hope people are not actually walking there, but we wanted that as an initial reference, near the green infrastructure where a person would be walking by, and then further away on the pavement or parking lot. We collected data for 25 minutes at each location at 1 meter height, which is like the center of mass of an average human, and logged data between 11 a.m. and 4 p.m. on sunny days in late June to early August to kind of get these hot summer days when this effective cooling would be most important. And this big equation here is representing a bunch of the types of variables that are collected by that sensor, that are inputs. But the main thing here is that this thing we're calculating, this TMRT, is called mean radiant temperature. And it's one of these types of metrics that biometeorologists use as something that relates to the thermal comfort of humans. Another thing we looked at was metals retention. So those of you that do stormwater sampling know that more traditional approaches are to get inflow and outflow water samples. That's costly and time intensive. And so one method that we've developed, and there's a reference on the bottom from some prior work that details the methodology here, was to look at the actual accumulation over time in the soils themselves, because soils are where a lot of the metals are being absorbed onto. And so we can kind of look at that long-term aggregation or accumulation. And so we took cores in different points in our rain gardens here. Of course, with the inlet being an important location where we expect a lot of soil to be settling out. Now, the thing is, we didn't have initial data from these sites, like time point 0. So one thing that we did as part of this method was to take a sort of internal reference, which represented the original design soil, but at the upper edge of the feature where we don't expect there to be any runoff actually inundating that location and adding metals to that spot. We then analyzed all these cores for the zinc concentration in particular. We also made infiltration measurements. There's of course a lot of methods out there, and we use this smaller, more portable infiltrometer because the students were doing all this sustainability research sustainably on bicycle. And so they were taking all these sensors around in that means. And so we used this smaller infiltrometer made by Meter Corporation called a mini disc infiltrometer. We made a bunch of measurements at each site. And some of our other measurements that we made included taking cores to look at soil carbon content, making measurements of vegetation diversity, which occurred along transects in each rain garden. And I want to acknowledge that some of this was done as part of prior work that our partners at Franklin and Marshall College had done, where a bunch of undergrad students went out to 100 rain gardens across Lancaster and did a lot of this vegetation surveying. And finally, we also did some surveys to look at the cultural services and some overall perceptions of services. I want to acknowledge that a lot of the data collected as part of this project was done by this fantastic team of undergrad researchers from Penn State and Franklin and Marshall. And I'm realizing I forgot to note earlier that the funding for this project came from Pennsylvania Sea Grant to explore some of these different ecosystem services. So starting now with heat mitigation. Okay, so there's a lot going on here to orient you to. So we have some schematics of our two sites on top. So these do reflect the actual sort of vegetation that is present in these two representative rain gardens. And as I noted, we took these measurements in the rain garden, adjacent, and further away on the sidewalk or parking lot. Now the plots below are these plots that represent the distribution of mean radiant temperature during the period of data logging. And we see temperature both via the values on the y-axis as well as in the colors. So we can see it in multiple ways. And what we're interested in are the distributions different between these locations? And what we see is that they're really pretty similar. These temperature distributions are very similar between these locations. So there's not really a detectable impact or change in temperature in these rain gardens that have grasses or short herbaceous vegetation. But there is an exciting part of the story, which is that when we go to rain gardens that had trees, like these two representative sites, now we go to the bottom and we see that the distributions of temperatures in the green infrastructure and nearby. And now I want to warn you, because of the way I made these plots, we actually have lower temperatures up here and represented by the darker purple colors. We have cooler temperatures than in the parking lot down here, represented in this very distinctive and different temperature distribution. And these are two examples, but we saw this as an overall trend in our sites that had trees present. Now this seems intuitive, right? But it hadn't really been documented before in this way in rain gardens. Moving on to metals removal. So what we see here are plots of zinc concentration in the different locations within the rain garden that we looked at. So we can see that at the inlet location, we see overall multiple times higher zinc concentrations than the reference location, showing that we're accumulating zinc in these sites, especially at the inlet where we would hope to be accumulating metals. And here, we're seeing this as a good thing because these sites are intended to be removing metals from the water that's then being discharged through the site. If we look at the ages of these sites, we actually see that the concentrations are highest in the sites that are the oldest. So we're seeing that there is consistent accumulation with time. Looking at soil carbon, so we didn't have initial time point zero samples again at these sites. We have a sense of the organic matter in these sites from initial soil specs, but not precise data. So we can't say for sure what net accumulation or change is. So what we did here was compare concentrations of carbon in green infrastructure features overall with turfgrass lawn samples from around Lancaster, looking at the overall magnitude. And we see when we look at these two box plots that the distribution is not really different. Some of the rain gardens do have higher amounts of carbon present, but we don't really have significantly higher presence of carbon in the soils of the green infrastructure features overall compared to lawns. Now, we did not consider the woody biomass at all in these sites. We were just focusing in on soil carbon in this particular sampling approach. We just kind of looking at some relationships between different factors, we see, not surprisingly, that there's a really nice correlation between the amount of zinc that's retained in these sites and the amount of carbon that's present in the soils, which is something we would expect, as carbon is known to be a factor that helps us absorb metals in these sites. And so it's an important design factor. So, the fact that we're not seeing interesting patterns with soil carbon makes us think, are there ways we could be doing better with design about thinking about more, woody mulch additions or biochar additions is something people are starting to talk about as ways to really enhance soil carbon sequestration in these features. With infiltration, the results were, as one would hope, when we look at infiltration rates in our rain gardens, which of course are designed with soil specs that are intended to promote a certain higher range of hydraulic conductivity. We see several times higher rates than our turfgrass lawns, which are a very prevalent land cover outside of the impervious surface in the city of Lancaster. Now moving into vegetation. So here we see a snapshot of a bunch of these different rain gardens across the city. And what the colors represent is specific functional classes of plants that we can use to make some connections about potential ecosystem services. So that lovely olive color there represents herbaceous plants. So these are a lot of the shorter flowering plants that we think about as being really important for pollinator habitat. There's also shrubs in quite a few of the sites, which a lot of them may be producing berries, which is a potential food source, thinking about habitat. And so we see, herbaceous plants are pretty common across most of these rain gardens, and about 2/3 have shrubs or trees present. And I want to acknowledge that my plant scientist colleagues down here led a lot of this work with the surveying of all of these plants and a bunch of the fantastic undergrad researchers. So again, the important aspect of these herbaceous plantings is this potential to be providing habitat, and this is not a stock photo. This is an actual photo by one of our undergrad researchers / amateur photographers of a swallowtail on butterfly milkweed in one of the rain gardens there. When we look at the number of plant species, this is reminding us that despite the fact that this is one category of green stormwater infrastructure, we can have a huge diversity in the design approaches here. And so while at some sites we had less than 4 species present, probably the sites that were mostly grasses, to sites that had over 30 different plant species present. Obviously, there's some connections here we can make to habitat, and we're talking about implications for heat when there's trees involved in some of these vegetation assemblages. But my colleagues have also connected the number of species present and some of the specific species present to actually increased infiltration patterns. I will acknowledge this is a correlation, not necessarily causation here, but we see some clear patterns here with enhanced infiltration and certain species present and the number of species. So vegetation is really important, is really connected to so many of these different services that we're interested in these vegetated stormwater features. I do want to put a word of caution up here as we start to think about the types of vegetation that we can have in these kinds of features. We think about habitat, our minds are often going to thinking about native species that will be suitable for some of the native pollinators that we want to be creating habitat in these environments. But it's also really important to remember the green stormwater infrastructure features are stressful environments for some biota. And we do some work with de-icing salts. So in addition to the pulses of water that they need to deal with, those of us in northern climates are aware of the de-icing salts that we're putting down on roads. And in some of these right-of-way bioswales, we can get a pretty serious amount of loading coming in. And so we've done some work looking at that. We see this image at the left where we've looked at some characteristic herbaceous species. This is Joe Pyeweed here, Eupatorium purpureum, and then this is switchgrass here. And this was actually Joe Pyeweed in this column, which didn't even come back up that year in the high salt treatment column. So my takeaway here is that a reminder that a dead plant will not provide any of these ecosystem services that we're interested in. And so we do need to be careful about some of these types of plants that we're choosing. And this is, of course, where our connections with our landscape architecture and landscape contracting colleagues are so important in thinking about what are the best plants to meet all these different desires. And so actually, this is a good time to mention my landscape architect colleague and landscape contracting colleague, Hung Wu and Margaret Hoffman, who have led some work also looking at the cultural services, social benefits, and perceptions. And so they ran some surveys that happened in Lancaster, but also to several other cities in the eastern US. And so what they wanted to explore was some of the perceived benefits from rain gardens, which they referred to here as a biodiverse swale. And they wanted to actually compare it to another type of stormwater feature that's very prevalent in our region, which is a grassed swale or grassed basin. We have a lot of dry grassed basins in our region. And so what we see here on the y-axis is a level of benefit perception. Higher is increased perception. And we see comparison between different types of benefits for the biodiverse swale or rain garden versus the grassed or turfed swale or basin. And so some of the things to point out here, in terms of benefits that were perceived, if we go up here to the top, we see the top one is enhanced neighborhood aesthetics. Now, interestingly, they actually perceived similar levels of benefit between the biodiverse swale and turf swale in Lancaster. In other cities, the biodiverse swale or rain garden did have a higher level of perceived aesthetics. We do see similar levels or slightly increased levels of perception across the biodiverse swale. But two things to point out where the turf basin actually won out was in recreation and health. So recreation makes sense, and I'll show an example on that in a second. Health is interesting, and I think that goes to concerns about pollen, the perception that there with diverse, vegetation species, we might be having increased issues with pollen and concerns about allergies with biodiverse basins. So this is a basin. This is a soccer field where my kids played soccer. And of course, when I was sitting there watching them, and I noticed that there was an outlet structure over here and realized we're actually playing soccer in the middle of a giant stormwater basin. This is something that they've been trying to do more in some of the townships around State College in central Pennsylvania. And I know some municipalities are thinking about this, but this is an opportunity for turf grass basins where we have this multifunctionality possible with recreation. So just looking a little bit at some perceptions of some of the ecosystem services that we were actually talking about before and measuring. So now we're going back to these things like habitat, heat mitigation, water quality improvement, and flood mitigation. In this case, the perceptions were that there were overall much higher benefits provided in the biodiverse swale or rain garden compared to the turf grass swale. And the one that had The biggest difference is habitat. So people are perceiving that there's much higher habitat benefits in a biodiverse swale versus the turf grass swale, which we would say the data would support that. And urban heat island mitigation is showing up as higher, and the fact that we could have trees present in these biodiverse rain gardens, again, would support the possibility for that as well. I did just want to take a moment to mention the potential for trade-offs or disservices. We kind of already touched upon that a little bit with this mention of concerns about allergens and pollen. I wanted to take a moment to talk about a little bit of work that we've done in this space in the past, thinking about some water quality versus carbon mitigation services. So this is stepping out of Lancaster for a second and looking at some sites where we're comparing dry grassed basins to wet grassed basins, where the wet basins, had permanent ponding zone in these sites. And so one thing we were looking at there was the potential for nitrogen removal via the microbial process of denitrification. And we found in these gray bars here, these are both the wet basins. And so the wet basins had much higher magnitude of this important nitrogen removal process versus the dry basins or the turf grass sites. We were also looking at the potential for natural biological greenhouse gas emissions. So we looked at, you could look at carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane, and here we're talking about methane. And so on the right are the wet basins, and the y-axes here are much higher than the ones at the left. And we see in the summer, these basins actually emit a decent amount of methane. And so we have this trade-off where these same wet conditions that enhance nitrogen removal by bacteria are also the same conditions that make bacteria produce methane emissions. Now, there's probably also carbon accumulation happening that might counter that, but it is something we have to think about in terms of what processes we want to prioritize the most. And I'll say, I'm not going to talk about it now, but we are playing with some different design tweaks where we can try to be able to minimize the greenhouse gas emissions while still promoting nitrogen removal with different design tweaks. I just want to mention a little bit of insight from the surveys on the disservices or concerns. And so interestingly, the biodiverse swales or rain gardens actually had some higher levels of perceived disservices or concerns. So some of the ones that came up on the highest were actually pests and unappealing appearance. So this is interesting, right? Because people are seeing aesthetic benefits from these features, but also concerned that if they're not maintained properly, there could potentially be an unappealing appearance there. And there is also, some concern about maintenance burden, which is a very real concern. So this brings me to start to wrap things up here. So some of the lingering questions coming out of this, we think back to Baltimore and this incredibly diverse assemblage of stormwater control measures that they had. We think, oh, that's could lead to potential, really diverse range of ecosystem services provided. But with all these different types of stormwater features that the maintenance staff has to manage, that could be a really big burden. So, maybe there's something in between where we can, still be thinking about prioritizing multiple services, but not doing it in a way that is, we have to do it smartly so that we're not making maintenance horrendous in our approaches. We clearly need to fill gaps in certain services, need to do better with some of the ways we're thinking about accounting for carbon sequestration in these features. And we really need more data on habitat provision. We're still doing a lot of hand waving and assumptions because we didn't have the right partners here to be helping us inventory the insects present. We see anecdotal evidence here of real presence of some pollinators and insects of interest in some of our Lancaster basins, but we really need to quantify that better. And of course, we really need to be looking at a more diverse range of green stormwater infrastructure as well. It takes a lot of effort to pull all these different folks together and get out and make all these different measurements. And so that's probably why not that many people are doing all this simultaneous measurement of different ecosystem services. So starting to pull things together with some summary points. So we found that Most rain gardens were demonstrating good metals accumulation and infiltration compared to, the very prevalent urban cover of turf grass. Our rain gardens with trees were the most effective for heat mitigation. So this is super important. If cities are articulating in their plans that they're choosing green infrastructure because they expect heat mitigation, we need to think about connecting that to the design aspects that will make that happen. Biodiverse rain gardens had higher aesthetic and perceived habitat benefits, but they also had higher concerns compared to grassed basin approaches. So it's really critical that we align the desired services with actual GSI design characteristics and where they're located, so the services are actually manifesting and accessible to people. And we clearly need to continue to make more measurements of this nature to allow us insight into properly designing for multiple functions. And I would say, rather than just focusing them on types of GSI, we clearly need to focus on these functional attributes, like the presence of trees, the particular soil specs. And so, the thing that I really think is important here is, as we seek to build in resilience to future climate change, multifunctional solutions are our best option for building in as much stormwater capacity as we can by disguising it for other purposes. So thinking about how we can build a basketball court that actually serves, in those larger events as additional stormwater storage, and lots of other kind of approaches like that. So with that, I'm going to call it a wrap, and I thank you for your attention.
Very good. Thank you, Lauren. What questions do we have for Lauren? Oh my goodness, we have lots. Good.
Thank you for the talk, Lauren. I was wondering with the heat mitigation example, because from my research, I also see that from transpiration alone urban trees, that doesn't provide as much cooling benefits as the shading. But in a place like Phoenix, where water is already scarce, I was wondering if you compared shading with gray infrastructure that's providing some of the heat mitigation versus using trees as a part of the heat mitigation strategy, because then umbrella or any shading structure is not taking up water, which is also a precious resource in the area.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think that was an important observation here, that just the provision of shade was really the important dominant factor in getting cooling. I didn't explicitly do research in that space in Phoenix, but I can say that, something that was very much on people's radar there was the fact that they have these lofty tree goals, in part because of wanting to have, tree-lined streets along the sidewalks where people are walking. But as you said, trees with broad canopies require a lot of water. And so they're trying to kind of figure out that sweet spot of, there are some native trees that do provide some shade, not as much as some other non-native species, but they are thinking about things like, lots of bus stations with shade structures as well. So there's a lot of factors to optimize there. And I think that is really important that, for example, that they are factoring in those water use considerations as they think about things like tree goals for cooling.
Good. I think we have questions online.
Lots of questions online. Our first one for today is, have there been any use or success in use of compost blankets in green infrastructure?
That's not something that I have particular worked on. I believe that others have been looking at that. I mean, one thing I've done in other water quality work is thought about the organic amendments in these soils. Obviously, I alluded to carbon being important for metals retention, and we're wanting to accumulate carbon for carbon sequestration, but we have to be really careful that carbon comes in many different types of organic matter, right? And so composts often also come with a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus, and so we have to be really careful about that in our organic matter choices, that we're using things that are, if we want to get carbon, we need to make sure we're not bringing available nitrogen and phosphorus that's then going to leach out of our system. So when we're thinking about establishing vegetation, it doesn't take a lot of organic matter to get these plants going. And, when we're getting atmospheric deposition of some nitrogen coming into our system, it's going to keep providing some of the nutrients to sustain them. So we shouldn't need a lot of additional nutrient amendments to sustain the vegetation.
We will take another in-person question.
In the stormwater world, we have this thing called the Clean Water Act that has driven, incentivized, I'll use the word incentivized, people to treat stormwater. So we have water quality, and that's the incentive there. But there are very few similar incentives to do the things that you've been talking about, provide the other functionality. Other than the motivation to do the right thing, can you think of some ways we could incentivize more incorporation of these other functions into our stormwater practices?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think that is like the $1 million question. I think, and I would love, honestly, to hear from some other practitioners' anecdotes. Maybe we can talk about this on the panel later, too. I think some cities are trying to pull from some of their other plans, like things related to climate goals or cooling plans. But yeah, we just, you lack that hard regulatory motivator like we saw from the CSO consent decrees. And so I think, cities are some of these social benefit surveys are showing us that, if people are more excited about these, then that's one way, as long as there are not a lot of additional costs there to meet those Clean Water Act goals, but also, get the community excited about the types of solutions that are being implemented there. But yeah, I think it's tough to motivate people to come together and think about, well, why might we be motivated to put in something that might require more maintenance to get more benefits if there's not something that requires us to do so. And I can say in Pennsylvania, we struggle with that a bit outside of the cities that have more resources to train people to do good maintenance. It is hard to pull people away from grassed basins, which are easier to maintain.
Let's take another online question.
How successful are trees in green stormwater infrastructure? They provide many benefits in terms of heat mitigation and nutrient uptake, but have you found that they are able to stay healthy while confined in these small basins that are full of pollutants? Plus, they contribute excess nutrients. Are trees still worth having in GSI when they require more maintenance and upkeep, especially in places like Minnesota where heat mitigation is not a major objective?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I see Randy kind of smiling over there because I've heard some anecdotes that there are challenges here, and I know elsewhere with trees staying healthy. Obviously, trees need a lot of space for their roots, and so we have this great potential for benefits, but we also have to think about they can be challenging when we're in these very dense, constrained urban environments, and so. Frankly, I think we need more work in that space. There's clearly a really high potential for benefits there, and maybe it doesn't make sense in Minnesota in spots where there's not, it's not a spot where there's going to be a lot of human benefit on the thermal comfort side to be prioritizing that. Obviously, there is potential for a lot of hydrologic benefit via transpiration there. I do think it's something that we need to do more work on. I feel like it hasn't been as big of an area of focus as it deserves. It's not something that other than what I talked about today, not that I've done a ton of work on myself, so I can't really say more than that at the moment.
I think it's a great question, and there will be a tree seminar in the future.
There you go.
So thanks for the presentation. I wanted to ask a question about the earlier part of your presentation, the work on multiple cities, diversity, but also density of SCMs. I work with regulated cities all the time, and I firmly believe there's this powerful story to be told about the good work done by cities, watershed districts, stormwater practitioners, that's undertold. So my question is, who's been the audience for that work? And who were you thinking about as the audience when you did it? And who of those entities and types of entities have proved to be the audience, and where have you been disappointed? Where, geez, why aren't these people paying any attention at all to this stuff?
Man, that's a tough question, Randy. Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna lie. This is what academics do sometimes. We do things because we think it's interesting. We hope that someone else will find it interesting. I think the hope there with a lot, I know there's these growing, emerging like green infrastructure exchanges that potentially, I'm trying to think of the green infrastructure exchange network. There's a lot of municipalities increasingly part of that where there's a lot of this learning from each other. So we see these cities that had the super tall blue bars that have put in so much of this green infrastructure. They've clearly learned a lot of lessons. I mean, I hear this even from Lancaster as a small city, like they've learned how to redo their inlets so that it's so much easier to do maintenance and properly scoop out the sediment without moving all the cobbles. And so there's so much to learn from each other there. And so I think our hope was like we paid for that paper to be open access, and the hope was that we could learn a bit from seeing, in that case of the time series with Baltimore, learning from, these shifts that have happened over time, seeing the different priorities that different cities have had and the different, maybe that sparks someone to get in touch with another city that they, feel like there's something they want to learn from what they've done and how it's been successful.
Let's take another online question.
Are there concerns with using green stormwater infrastructure as fields for children to play, given that green stormwater infrastructure accumulates pollutants?
Yeah, so that is a good question that I think is something, we can talk about more on the panel maybe, where, we do have to be careful with some of these potential co-benefits where, certain habitat uses in systems where it's a site with a ton of loading. There's a wide variation in the loading of metals rates depending on what type of surfaces we're draining to a system. And so it really does take a long time to get to levels that are considered toxic. We actually looked at that in the 2023 study where we developed those methods. And we looked at some basins on Penn State and Cornell campus and found that pretty much none of our sites were almost none of them were close to levels of concern for different habitat, but for some of them we were hitting those levels. We had a site that was getting tons of zinc in because of the type of galvanized roof that was draining to it. And so we do have to be careful about that, and there's some work that's been done looking at like types of amphibians that have had sensitivity in developing habitat in stormwater ponds with different levels of metals. As far as exposure to kids, I think, as long as we're, kids do sometimes eat dirt. And so that might be something to be a little bit more cautious about if, there's a park in a stormwater basin. But I think unless it's a very old basin with really high loading rates, we're probably not going to be reaching levels of concern there. But these are things that we need to talk about as we think about trying to make things multifunctional in different ways.
So let's take maybe one more question before the break. Do we have another question in the room? Otherwise, I know we have some online. Sure.
Yeah, this might be one of the questions with no answer. It's the conflict between the urban forest and the urban environment, right? The more you include green infrastructure, urban forest, urban canopy over the top of impervious surface, you have the law of unintended consequences of increased downstream nutrient loading, right? And it always amazes me, moving into a cold climate. I've come from a warm climate where it's an evergreen forest, to one where people just rake all the leaves into the street because that's what they do. And I think, why do you even do that? Why is it just not mulched in place? So we think about the benefits of all the green infrastructure without thinking about the disbenefit and the balance equation of the total environmental design. And it comes back to urban planning. If we were to go back and look at cities knowing what we know now and started redeveloping in 1700s, how would we design a city differently? Just that's probably more of a panel discussion than a question.
Yeah, well, I would just throw out there street sweeping and leaf sucking is one of the best BMPs that you could have, right? So having that to get up some of the leaves that are there and before they're getting into the street gutters, but of course, changing mindsets, right? So not just raking all our leaves away to have that perfect manicured lawn, but letting some of those leaves be mulched in place to restore the nutrients to the soil. I know biogeochemist Bill Schlesinger has like put out an editorial a year or two ago, kind of putting that out there, like, why are we wasting this good natural fertilizer? So there's a couple, there's technological solutions, but also social changes there too.
Well, very good. That will conclude our Q&A and our keynote presentation. We'll take a short break, 5 minutes, and then we'll start up with our panel discussion. But in the meantime, help me thank Lauren for the presentation. Welcome back to the Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series. Again, my name is Andy Erickson. I'm so pleased to be able to moderate our panel discussion. I'm so thankful for our panelists to join us today. I'm going to start by introducing each panelist and ask for their relation to our topic, and then we will get into your questions. So please have your questions ready. If you're online, please put your questions in the Q&A. I'm going to start on the far side, my right, your left. Our first panelist is Jamison Wendel, who is the Fisheries Habitat Manager at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. So Jamison, from your experience and perspective, how do you relate to today's topic?
Oh, thanks, Andy. So in my position, we primarily work to protect, restore, and enhance habitat for fish communities throughout the state. So this connecting to stormwater, there's a number of threads that are connecting us primarily through floodplain connectivity is one of our main examples. We protect, restore, and enhance. So with protection, that can take any form of acquiring easements or flood easements, things like that on high priority floodplains, intact connected floodplains. Restoration, we do a lot of stream restoration work. And again, that's not only creating that natural stream channel, creating diverse habitat for fish and stream communities, but also connecting to floodplains as well in those environments. And then we also work a lot on enhancement, and that tends to be, and we tend to lean more in the green side of the spectrum here, but we work a lot on not only floodplain enhancement, but also off-channel enhancement, whether that's through impoundments, that have multiple benefits. We've worked on some where there may be different cells allocated towards perennial wetlands and some other cells that are, seasonally flooded for flood damage mitigation as well. So I've worked anything from small fraction of an acre retention ponds adjacent to a lake, all the way up to tens of thousands of acres on a retention impoundment for the Fargo-Moorhead diversion. So we've really worked on a broad range of sizes as well as implementation strategies.
That's great. Thank you, Jamison. Our next panelist is Stephanie Johnson, who is a senior water resources engineer at Barr Engineering Company and serves as district engineer for a few of the watershed districts locally here to Minnesota. So Stephanie, from your experience and perspective, how do you relate to today's topic?
Yeah, good morning. Thanks, Andy. So in my work experience, I've worked directly in this area of planning for design, thinking about operation and maintenance needs, and then also overseeing the design and implementation programs for green stormwater infrastructure for probably about the last 10 years. It's been a pretty main focus of the work that I've been doing, both in the public and private sectors. So before coming to Barr, I worked in the public sector on these types of programs and putting together funding strategies and, again, thinking about how we implement them and how we take care of them once they are implemented and where the right places are to put different types of practices. The firm that I work for now, Barr Engineering Company, has done a lot of this type of work over the last several decades across the Minneapolis and St. Paul metro area. So we've designed and implemented a lot of these types of systems and then worked with our clients to see how they're performing over time, retrofit them in some cases as we've learned more, and then think about how to support them as they fold them into their policies and strategies to keep them functional.
That's great. Thank you, Stephanie. Our next panelist is Rebecca Carlson, who is the CEO and founder of Resilience Resources and the district engineer for the Clearwater River Watershed District. Rebecca, from your perspective and experience, how do you relate to the topic?
Thanks, Andy. During my career and during the scope of the whole thing starting back in 1998, I have seen the shift from us really focusing just on phosphorus or just on sediment to us integrating a more, a broader set of evaluation tools and a broader set of goals for our restorations. So we've incorporated looking at indices of biotic integrity. I've had clients modify their goal statements and their raison d'etre statements from just water quality to, water and natural resources. So, and I've worked in the urban space quite a bit as well, but one of the things I'm going to mention here is that I have the privilege of working in the agricultural space with stormwater and habitat and water resources. And one of the things that we've been doing is when we do a program, we also quantify the benefit to the people. So several of our programmatic tools that we have to support landowners will have to quantify that benefit. Like there's going to be an improvement in your soil condition. There's going to be a reduction in the amount of fertilizer that you need to apply. There's going to be an increase in yield. There's going to be carbon sequestration. And oh, by the way, there's a downstream water quality benefit. And then we're also taking it downstream and looking at where we have larger regional systems that are kind of on the size and scale of gray infrastructure, so they're big. We have space and room to consider other habitat features. So, for example, in a outlet structure of a stormwater, a water quality piece, designing the outlet structure so it functions like groundwater infiltration, that kind of thing. Or then in those smaller distributed urban spaces, looking at things, working for watershed districts and municipalities, really focusing on and trying to understand and convey how much money and how many resources we need to really maintain these systems so that we can keep our goals, keep our progress towards goals on track.
That's great. Thank you, Rebecca. And for those of you that might be online that aren't from Minnesota and not familiar with watershed districts, we have watershed districts here in Minnesota. I encourage you to go online, see what those are all about, because they are a very powerful tool, in my opinion, in Minnesota to be able to tackle these watershed problems that we have. So check that out online. We are now open for questions. Again, if you're online, use the Q&A function. You can upvote questions in the Q&A, and we will sort those by the most upvotes. So pick your favorite questions. If you have questions here in person, please raise your hand, and we'll start taking those now. Who would like to start us in the panel?
So it's always interesting to think about what's missing in a presentation. And so what I found myself thinking about was environmental justice. And you can now find plenty of data indicating that neighborhoods of low income, neighborhoods that were redlined, have far less green space, far less tree canopy. So the question becomes, how is addressing environmental justice a benefit when it comes to locating and implementing green infrastructure? Another easy.
So, Randy, to answer your question, I think this is just how I've approached it. So first of all, I think it really depends on the client. There are a small number of watershed districts or municipalities who are even really thinking about environmental justice. So it really has to be incumbent upon that client understanding and then asking and incorporating it into the scope. So as consultants like Stephanie or I work towards that, we can we can understand it and incorporate it, but it's maybe going to fall on deaf ears. I'll give you an example for Capital Region on a project that I did for them on the Phelan Corridor and Sweet Hollow Park. They were trying to restore surface water to that park. So there's low-income areas around the park. And one of the features that I found so compelling about is that Capital Region is bring water back, bring back the visual manifestation of water in our communities, in our parks. To me, that auditory representation of water is beautiful. There's a lot of ties to improvements in mental health, so kind of the social justice, but really just baseline mental health improvements with exposure to that kind of nature. And I also think just having more visual representations, our civil infrastructure is so often invisible, like our public health system, so people don't really understand the costs, the benefits, the value. And I'll give you just one example of how I incorporated this, which is, street sweeping is fabulous. We all love street sweeping. It's so cheap. We were looking at stormwater runoff from this low-income neighborhood as a source, tons of floatables, tons of sediments. So the only way we would have really been able, we couldn't build a structure big enough with the space or the money we have. So we were looking at street sweeping. But part of the presentation to that board, who was very concerned with social justice, very concerned with we don't want underserved or underrepresented areas, was to say, look, we can do street sweeping, but you're going to have to do 3, 4, 5 times of street sweeping a year. Most of the parking is on street. So if you're towing people in a low income area and they're coming out, a couple times a year to find their car gone, they miss work, they have to pay a fee. That is an undue burden on this community to provide a downstream benefit. So that's kind of how, for me, it's more of a, I try to do it very simply. So compare everything, like this is better than this, and I rank it, one of the categories is social justice. You always have to explain it. Like, here's the impact on the community.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I can share maybe about some of how I've seen environmental justice influence and also be a motivator for green stormwater infrastructure and integrating into some of the projects that I've been involved with. So in Minneapolis, there's various policies through the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board where they recognize the value of greenery and mental health benefits, and then have looked across the city and mapped out and have policies associated with the maximum distance that they would like each resident to have to, say, engage with some kind of park space. And as part of that work, they've recognized that obviously there's certain areas of the city that have less access to parks or green space than other areas of the city, and they've been actively working to address that. One of these areas is an area that is in kind of central Minneapolis, and through a project that I was working on several years ago, there was this overlay of a need for park space, a lack of park space, and a lot of development happening and an opportunity for regional stormwater management to manifest. So this again is one of those examples of a multifunctional and multi-benefit opportunity to come in. So pretty unique example where there was a whole block that was redeveloping and being knocked down, the street was being reconstructed, several new developments being planned and looked at for implementation. So this project in particular, we had an opportunity to get in on the front end and do some urban planning to look at stormwater management and then figure out how we could best maximize the benefits of that stormwater management from a water quality perspective, flood reduction perspective, and then also bring in some of these other drivers, social and economic drivers as associated with the value of park space. And the park board was a big player in that to say, hey, how can we come in and partner with the private development, the city, and be part of this conversation to think about designing this stormwater feature to provide some park benefits. And so that's how that project ultimately unfolded. And we were able to successfully design and integrate a regional stormwater management system that functions as a park space when it's not full of stormwater. And now there's a community garden next to it and it uses some of the stormwater for drip irrigation to water that. So I think that's one just real life example of how some of those things have played out. I will echo what Rebecca said, where I do think that there's also a flip side to this, and that's something that we have to be mindful of and look to, I think, our urban planning partners to help think about is the impact of bringing green stormwater infrastructure into community and rising property values, gentrification, and some of the other factors that come along with that, which is those are real and difficult public policy questions to figure out how to address that.
I think we could have an hour conversation on this pretty easily. The simple solution, the simple first step is to have those conversations with those communities, genuine, engaged conversations, listening to what their goals and objectives and needs are. We have just very briefly, one great example on the opposite side of the river here where we've been participating and working with Dakota communities on a culturally significant site and doing some planning for some riparian corridor restoration, where it's providing the goal is to create a more natural environment along that riparian community, and then also provide some of these additional ecological benefits, flyway communities, things like that. So it's similar in some ways, and then it's providing those multiple benefits, as many of the multiple benefits as possible, but having those communications with diverse project teams and developing those goals.
And I'll just add, as these guys have said, this idea of multifunctionality is where the green infrastructure can be so valuable when we have communities underserved in multiple ways, including things like urban heat island issues. But we also have to be careful that, when these communities are so underserved in even most basic needs, that, they may be like, why are you spending money on these fancy green infrastructure features and not on, dealing with our storm sewer inlets, or the fact that I can't, get a reliable means of getting to work every day. So there's, holistic perspectives need to address all these things that have been really underserved. And so that's where just listening and not just being so top down is really, really important. We have done some work to actually look at the location of green stormwater infrastructure in a few cities, and finding that, obviously being really intentional with the planning is really important, and not just listening to those loud, affluent voices. There are some issues with some inequitable distribution where you're seeing more in the affluent neighborhoods, but Baltimore and Portland, Oregon, for example, have been doing hard to try to make sure that they are, addressing all the neighborhoods' needs in some way and not being biased.
That's great. I love that you brought up, gentrification and some of these social issues and equity. And Jamison's exactly correct. We could have a whole seminar on that. And so look for that in a future seminar. We'll probably tackle some of those issues in a much longer discussion. But let's take, unless there's any other comments on that, let's take another online question.
Yeah, continuing with the theme of, community involvement and social justice, environmental justice. Someone was asking online, I'm not going to get into details because it is a little more specific to your presentation, Lauren, but someone is asking about the differences in perception between green infrastructure, different kinds of green infrastructure, turf grass versus diversely planted swales, and asking about was there public education campaigns of any sort in the area where you were doing that research, and I guess maybe anyone else can talk about their experience with public education and the adoption of green stormwater infrastructure as a result of that?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. And obviously, this is perceptions that are reflecting people's interaction or not with these kind of features. And so this was led by by some of my colleagues. And so some of this work is published, so you might take a look at that. And maybe that's also a future seminar, to have them come in to talk a little bit more about their survey work. So it wasn't an explicit part of their work to also be going out and doing engagement, but obviously that could strongly influence, have people actually, do they have green infrastructure in their neighborhoods? Is it just something they've heard about from a friend? Has, their community, MS4, have been doing active outreach of certain types that they've been exposed to. Obviously, all those things would strongly influence people's perception or understanding of the functions of, is this just a messy garden? Oh, it's actually water is meant to go in here and provide these specific benefits.
Yeah, I guess I can speak to that maybe in two different ways. I think from an education standpoint, we see that there is definitely a lot of resources put into public education in at least the Minnesota stormwater community around the value of native plantings, the deeper roots, like the other benefits that can bring to stormwater infiltration, soil health, and things along that line. So I think that can be helpful to get the word out to some communities, I will say, to some communities. I think that Jamison made an excellent point of the value and the importance of stakeholder engagement and going out and talking to the communities that you're going to be putting these designs and these types of features into, to understand what they value, what they're going to actually maintain, what their perceptions are of the different types of infrastructure. So we do that through the bulk of our projects that we undertake. And I think that happens in two different ways. The first one might be with just the common public out at a stakeholder engagement meeting, and maybe we've just got images of different types of plantings that could go into a rain garden or could go into a bioswale, and saying, which ones of these look like something that you want in your park space, or that might, feel like a benefit in your community. And again, I think culturally, we'll see that we get different feedback in different types of neighborhoods or from different types of groups that we're working with. So I think that can be really helpful, because again, it's a lot of what we're doing is we're installing this type of vegetation and infrastructure in public places, and we're asking them to take care of it so that it operates over the long term. I can't tell you the number of projects that I've been involved in where we've put in, a piece of green stormwater infrastructure or a native planting, and 2 years later it's gone because the public didn't like it. And so our client said, well, we just got so many complaints that it looked messy, or people had a fear that there was snakes in it, and so it felt unsafe. And so we just ended up cutting it down. So we've learned, I think, to say, okay, well, let's ask those questions beforehand to think about, because there are other solutions. We have landscape architects who can choose other types of plantings that maybe bring similar types of benefits, but have a different aesthetic. In one community, the aesthetic might be really important. We just did a project, say, around the state capitol, where they didn't want something that looked more native grasses and things like that. It was more of a institutional organization. They wanted something that looked a little more tended. And so that was an important consideration in terms of plant selection. So how do we still put in something that brings a stormwater benefit, but has more of that presentation aesthetically, that it fits with what the goals are of that site?
One of the things that I've found, and Lauren pointed this out, that the values and those perceptions shift geographically. So having that comparison and having a range of geographic settings is great to look at. What it means for individual engineers is that you're going to have to use a reference point of that specific area where you're working. So Minnesota residents are going to have different value sets and different perceptions given the resources that we have here. So we have, Wimmera, we have Blue Thumb. There's so much nature, and there's so much outreach. But one of the things that I found is, the weather's a little weird. So I find myself when I do, why is the lake weird this year? Well, the weather was kind of weird this year. And it's every year, so I need a new answer. And the perceptions change with the climate, or with the weather, I will say, not the climate. But so I have about 7 weeks in certain areas of the state where I have people calling and saying, why are there dams here? We need to get rid of these dams. it is too wet, I can't put my dock in, my turf grass and riprap fell into the lake. It's flooded and it fell into the lake. So, and then there's like 6, 7, 8 weeks until people start calling, when are you gonna close the dam? It's too dry, my dock, it's under, it's out of the water. So those perceptions and values shift. And one of the things that we've done to try to, ride that wave is use those extremes to educate and use those extremes to communicate and ask questions. People are still unhappy at either end of the spectrum, but at least they get a little bit of information. It's been a challenge.
And I would add in rural environments too, that's a great selling point. Additionally, we work on a lot of very degraded ditches, we might say, that are with highly erosive banks that are not very aesthetically pleasing, and we can come in and do some stream restoration and create a natural green riparian corridor that mimics or restores to a natural stream channel that is very desirable in some of these rural areas that don't have a lot of those water features. And once you start and you develop some of those restoration opportunities, it generates a lot of additional interest from adjoining communities as well.
Yeah, I think with any new technology, this is something we have to confront, right? Is we need to help people understand it and not just assume that they'll know what it's doing and appreciate it. But it is like a two-way street where it's like, we can help them understand, we being also like, extension and outreach folks, that this is part of their job and they're really good at connecting with people on these things, helping them understand that this thing is meant to hold water. We're meant to have a diverse range of vegetation that will senesce and die back a bit. And what is it meant to look like when it's functioning well? But then also understanding what their aesthetic preferences are and finding that sort of in between of, well, this is what we thought would work well hydrologically or, best water quality benefit, but maybe they just really hate how that looks. Then if they're going to tear it out, just like the dead plants, then it's not going to do much good.
So the theme I'm sensing here, it's coming out in multiple voices. I'm hearing working together, and that's not only community and designers, but like construction and maintenance and owners. It's like all of those pieces have to be a part of that conversation to really get to success. So keep that in mind. Well, let's take another question. That was an online question. So what questions do we have in the room for our panel today?
I'll reiterate a question that was asked earlier about like the drivers. We have Clean Water Act that's like controlling the stormwater sort of regulation, but then stakeholders' opinions definitely drive a lot of these planning decisions. But then beyond that, how do you sort of like communicate these perceived benefits of these multifunctional green infrastructure and convincing people that they should plan and build them and maintain?
I would say we often tailor our message to the audience, for sure. We work with a lot of watershed districts, local government units, where the emphasis may be on flood damage reduction with these storage, but then also we can provide, hey, there's an additional funding mechanism to provide some habitat benefits additionally within this. And there's aesthetic opportunities here. You're bringing in birders for waterfall areas, things like that. So it may not be something we lead with on different groups of, say, if the priorities are flood damage reductions, then yeah, but there might be an opportunity to provide additional benefits here. Let's get a diverse group of people together to talk about how we might plan for some additional benefits that can be added on top of this. And in Minnesota, I think we're all aware, we're extremely fortunate to have the Legacy Amendment that provides that funding opportunity, not only for implementation, but for a lot of that outreach as well.
I'd say in my experience, some of the other drivers that come into play in the projects that we've worked on is there's been a lot of interest and request in kind of the transportation area in recent years, in the state of Minnesota at least, for recognizing the value that trees and vegetation can bring from a pedestrian experience. There's some research out there that it helps to, when folks see trees and they're kind of driving down a tree-lined street, that they tend to slow down a little bit. So there can be some of those, again, kind of transportation benefits that come out of that. So that's been a place that we've seen more interest from that portion of capital project planning and implementation to say, is there some synergies here to bring green stormwater infrastructure in as a way to combine that with, say, tree implementation? That's been something that we've seen come up on a lot of different types of projects. I think another one that I've seen is businesses coming in and recognizing maybe some financial benefit, if you will, to whether it's increased greenery or bringing some of that, bringing nature into their development, let's just say, recognizing that it improves their residents' experience to be able to walk out the front door and, see a stormwater feature that looks like a water feature. You have to maintain it to make sure that it keeps looking like that. But those are other places that I think we've seen drivers to bring, recognizing that you have to do stormwater management. It's just the practicality of there's a regulation, but how can we do it in a thoughtful and innovative way to use that resource and leverage that to meet some of our business drivers, say from like the developer standpoint. So again, those are some of the ways I've seen it come up. Also from, say, more like nonprofit or faith-based communities, often there's kind of that altruistic driver where they'll come and say, we recognize that this is just, it's altruistically better. It's helps the planet, helps the environment. So how can we bring that in and invest some more resources into doing this type of work to meet our requirements of having to implement stormwater management?
Andy mentioned the uniqueness of watershed districts. I know some other states have watershed districts. Minnesota is largely covered by watershed districts. So I'm going to step back even a little bit from what drives things today. Watershed districts started out most of them started out with flooding, preventing flooding from development to downstream landowners. Many of them, and now all of them, have since adopted water quality as a standard. So we went from flooding to flooding and water quality, and then we added the natural resource piece of it. All of the watershed districts, or most of the watershed districts, have development review regulations. So in addition to places that are MS4s that are required to meet some of those stormwater regulations, there's a large portion of the state that have development regulations somewhat consistent with the MS4 requirements for volume, for water quality, rate control. And we also have places in the state, and the first place where I really started looking into green infrastructure as for a client that was trying to solve a problem was down in Prior Lake, where there were super tight soils. So D soils. So I mean, it's analogous to having places where there's a lot of impervious, but we were looking at trying to meet volume requirements in places with D soils. So we looked at things like capture and reuse. And I remember making the call to talk to some of these, they weren't cisterns at the time, but just basically holding tanks. And I said, well, we want to capture and reuse this stormwater. He's like, why would you want to do that? And then, it was 5 years later, maybe, that they started selling it specifically for that purpose, the product. So, I mean, but he was like, you don't need to do that. That's very expensive. Why would you try to do, you just turn on the faucet. It's going to be. So that, I think, in Minnesota has been a good driver of looking at vegetation. We've looked at evapotranspiration, did some of the studies, I think, with Andy. So that was kind of take it a couple steps back. If you want to kind of replicate that Minnesota piece, finding those drivers, you're looking at solving problems in response to regulatory requirements.
Let's take another online question.
Given the buildup of contaminants in the growing media, any thoughts regarding the future disposal of these media or even potential harvesting of certain constituents?
So in the previous work we did, we found that for the most part, these basins where I think our oldest was like 20 years old, we were still not really maxing out in sort of the maximum potential absorption capacity of these soils. So, it depends on the loading rate, so what type of surfaces are draining and how much, what quantity of metals is actually being shed off that. But, as long as it's not a super high rate, we should be able to last decades before we have to refresh soils. But then we do need to confront the fact that once we max out the absorption capacity, we would start exporting metals, and we don't want to do that. And so, this is where I'd maybe look to the folks in the consulting space. It's my understanding that landfilling is one of our main options there, but I'll let you guys speak more to that. If anybody else is familiar.
It's a very expensive, icky question. We suffered that in Minnesota looking at, because we have a lot of stormwater basins. So sedimentation ponds and PAHs in asphalt sealant. So whereas municipalities, weren't even looking at cleaning out their basins, and all of a sudden, we should maybe do that because why is it full of sediment? Because that's how we designed it. And then that's what it's there for. And then they, started disposing and then realizing, well, we actually need an MPCA permit. We need a SDS permit to do some of this. And then all of a sudden the costs went from, they increased by probably an order of magnitude or more for projects that used to be a simple public works, grab a backhoe and dip out these ponds. And I don't think we have good, the answer is if you're, looking for a gap in knowledge, that is, there's one. I'm not sure what we do is the answer. Hopefully Stephanie has an answer.
Just send it down those lines.
We'll hand that one to Andy.
I'll actually encourage folks. Our seminar this year in August, Ryan Winston actually talked a bit about accumulation of pollutants in rain garden and green infrastructure media. He had collected a lot of data, and there's some information there, so I encourage you to check out that seminar. And actually, Shirley Clark actually talked a bit about it too, accumulation of pollutants, and then sometimes subsequent release of those pollutants under road salt conditions. So chloride from road salt in cold climates can actually mobilize some of these contaminants as well. So again, one of these unintended consequences, it's doing what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to remove pollutants. But now the challenge is, what do we do with that once it's there? So it's a very important question. It is a knowledge gap. There's definitely more room for research, both in stormwater ponds and green stormwater infrastructure, but there is some data out there. There is some research. There are some researchers doing good studies on it, but we are still just scratching the surface. Great question. Let's take another in-person question. I believe that was an online question. Who has another question for our panel today? Otherwise, we have lots online. Let's take another one online. Oh, go for it.
I'm kind of in the gray area here. I was wondering, have you observed any sort of correlations, either positive or negative, between ecosystem services provided by a certain piece of infrastructure and the maintenance demand for that installation? And do you have any tips for sort of optimizing green infrastructure to maximize services while minimizing maintenance?
So I may have one thought in mind. This was up in the Red River Basin. There was a large impoundment detention off-channel storage site, and they broke up the overall site into different cells so that there was one cell that's perennial wetland, there's another that's an ephemeral wetland, but then they also had cells that were put into agricultural production so that those cells may flood seasonally, but they would be able to rent those cells out to farmers so that there was an income being generated to help support some of that maintenance, with the agreement that it may only be able to produce a crop every 7 out of 10 years or something like that, but that they did have that consistent income coming in then, which is one of the biggest challenges, right? Is, okay, we have we have a lot of funds available for implementation of these types of projects, but how are we going to fund maintenance? So that's one mechanism that, in addition to the revenues generated from the Watershed District, they had a dedicated revenue source to address any maintenance concerns that may come up with that off-channel storage.
So this SAFL has been working on kind of a BMP manual for maintenance. And, because we're sort of, we're evolving, the basin started construction so that we've got basins that are 30, 40, years old. I have in my watershed district projects that are, 40 years old that were phosphorus or sedimentation reduction, mitigation for internal loading from a wetland, several of those projects. I think we're evolving. So the clients are evolving to understand, I can't just build something and need the funding. Watershed districts have typically the funding. It doesn't mean it's easy for us to do it. Also, our grant, if we're winning legacy grants, we're required to have monies for funding and to demonstrate that. But I think it's this learning process that we go through that's sort of an iterative process with organizations like SAFL, with the consultants, with the clients that are the watershed districts or the municipalities where, Stephanie and I will sit down and we'll talk to the client and clients, well, this really surprised us last time, so please consider maintenance next time. But it's not, it's individual engineers kind of going through their own checklist based on their own experience and, working with their teams of people to see what we've seen. So it's, if you've seen systems fail in a certain way, you're going to be very sensitive to that. If you've seen nightmare maintenance, you're going to be really sensitive to mitigating that in the future. So, and then that kind of wraps around to that data ends up getting funneled to organizations like SAFL so that we can have manuals. And Minnesota's, I think, been really good at that process of, it doesn't do any good if only Stephanie or I understand these maintenance. They're so widespread that we need a democratization of this data, this information. So having MPCA Stormwater Manual as part of this, funding SAFL and research and these seminars as part of that, I think it's just a process of doing that. So we've mastered, I don't want to say we've mastered a few, we've learned a few things. We've learned a few things and we have some BMP, some manuals around best practices, and I think we just sort of build that library as we go forward. I don't think we're there yet, but I think we're just all in that process of learning.
I'd say that, we think about those different cities that had different mixes of SCMs. There was that example of Baltimore that had all these different types. And even though that sounds like, okay, that's great, we're going to get this whole range of services, that's probably a nightmare for maintenance. And I think we can still prioritize something like habitat by thinking about a couple different key herbaceous flowering species, but we don't need to have everything. We could stick with one general type of rain garden that has consistent maintenance that people can be trained on, and a couple of key plant species that will provide that range of habitat. And so it's like being smart about it. New York City has gone for a certain type of right-of-way bioswale with a consistent design. And, I think, I'm not sure what the range of their plant palette is, but tried to make it easier for maintenance by the park staff that's going to be coming through and cutting back those plants. And so I think we can try to do this in a smarter way while still getting those co-benefits.
I think it's actually okay to say we've mastered some of these things, because once you get proficient enough with something, you understand how little you actually know about it and how many challenges are still there in front of you. So I think we're kind of at that spot. We're discovering all of these things that we still have to figure out and work through, challenges and barriers we have to overcome to get where we really want to go, right? I think we're a little more eyes open about some of those things. So I actually want to ask a question about, so a lot of our discussion so far, and even some of the questions, are really focused on green infrastructure and ecosystem services, and thinking it's not really been this way, but we often think very small in our scales, right? We're thinking individual rain gardens and the people that are walking by it in those neighborhoods and those communities. But oftentimes we are wanting results in our natural resources that are a much bigger scale. If I think about fisheries, or I think about habitat, or I think about even lakes and TMDLs, many of those are a much broader scale than green infrastructure kind of pockmarked throughout our watershed. So the question is, how do we think about that differently? How do we change that? Or how are you thinking about bigger picture, downstream receiving water goals? And then how does that change how we do decisions throughout the watershed? And one approach is just putting BMPs everywhere, but do we know enough about the link about individual practices and downstream responses? Or could we learn more there?
I think there's a lot more to learn. There's some somewhat robust tools in terms of predictions of watershed loading export for different things, WASP, HSPF. What I find in each of these models is that there's not a great way to capture that fade and transport piece. So not every rain garden is the same. A rain garden further away from your resource, your targeted resource, is not going to have as much benefit for the cost as one that may be close. So I think that a lot of the focus on what we have something called One Watershed, One Plan, which is sort of the next iteration of TMDLs or Clean Water Act studies, total maximum daily loads, has been to try to prioritize things because it's, and that's been part of that escalation of everybody having the same understanding of how we cite BMPs, how we best management practices, how we build them, how we maintain them. And I think there's still just a really big gap. And when, as a watershed district, we have that tie and that link because that's in our directive to look at our receiving waters. Not all MS4s do. So the municipalities are really looking at that development review or the MS4s from a different perspective, just saying, we're going to butter it like toast. We're going to butter the watershed district like toast. Everybody gets a little bit of butter. But the reality is this, prioritize, target, monitor, is to say we don't want to butter it like toast. We want little dabs of jam everywhere that really get you the best cost benefit. And I don't think, probably unpopular opinion, probably gonna get in trouble. I don't know that One Watershed, I think that they tried to get it to go that direction. I just don't think it's been good. I think that's one of the skill sets that's still kind of up top with a few people, and it hasn't percolated down as well as we need it to get the benefits for the cost. Because when we we all know the cost of doing it. We can't afford to butter our toast. We need to figure out dabs of jam. So yeah, I would say that that's a huge gap.
Yeah, I would say in the work that I do with my watershed clients, often our work and our drivers from an ecosystem standpoint start with the receiving water body and what the water quality needs are within that receiving water body. So we start there. We do a calculation, we do a TMDL, we figure out what are the load reductions that are needed to get this water body back to a healthy spot in terms of the regulatory requirements. And then we look to the watershed and we say, where are opportunities to do implementation, to improve practices, to either put in stormwater management practices, work with the cities on their street sweeping, do in-lake management, et cetera. I think where some of the sweet spot starts to come together in terms of advancing and bringing other ecosystem services through the implementation of GSI is to bring in some of those other planning layers. So some of the watershed clients that I work with, for example, have connectivity corridors that have been identified. So back from, say, maybe in Minneapolis, it might be Mississippi River as a major flyway. And we know that we have green space that's set back from the river corridor with parks or various other kind of green spaces. And how can we use green infrastructure to create additional connectivity to give that habitat? It doesn't have to be everywhere, right? But we can create more corridors and use GSI as a way to bring additional tree canopy, and then think about that in our tree selection and our design criteria to increase that and bring those ecosystem benefits to the urban environment in that way. So I think those are ways that I've seen to kind of thread that needle and bring those together. But for us, again, it always starts with that receiving water body, and then we kind of bring in those other habitats, land use needs, and that, connect those back to those other planning layers.
I think for me, in my work, we always start at the watershed scale and then start drilling down. So, so a little bit easier question, I think, for me. But and it's connectivity again, not only lateral connectivity, connection to floodplain, but also longitudinal connectivity, say for streams, so that we have connectivity as a corridor for fish passage or amphibians, reptiles, whatever the corridor may be, so that we may do an assessment of road stream crossings in a watershed and then prioritizing those crossings not only for fish passage, but then also for floodplain connectivity, whether it's a floodplain relief culvert that is used for 1 week out of the year, perhaps, when at a bankful event, where that floodplain is providing that culvert is providing direct connectivity to a floodplain and reducing sediment and reducing flood damage impacts. Or it can be, drilling down to a specific lake and then getting down to those BMPs that are addressing phosphorus concerns. But typically, we start at the watershed scale, work with partners on developing 1W, 1Ps, as was mentioned, or working on assessment with a RAPS assessment or collecting that data, monitoring data as well. So, we like starting at the watershed scale.
Well, and I'll add to that. I think one piece that I didn't mention, but is a pretty interesting area that comes up as well in a lot of these discussions with my watershed clients is soil health. And so that maybe comes up less in terms of designing and implementing green stormwater infrastructure than it comes into the practice of protection of existing landscape and greenery, and how do we think about soil health in the context of that. And that's an interesting space. There's a lot of, I think, research that's needed there, and that's one of the maybe the newer focus areas that we grapple with, and some of the ecologists on our team grapple with in talking to our clients currently as we kind of think about that and how they might layer it into their policies and plans.
I think we still have some work to do with our traditional H&H sort of models, figuring out what's happening at the outlet of our watershed with representing the function of these ecological treatment features in models that were meant for gray infrastructure. So I think we still have improvements to do there on the water quality side. I think you made some great points about, in the planning process, pulling in these other layers to think about connections to other ecosystem services. Here in Minneapolis, St. Paul, hopefully the long-term ecological research program is thinking about measuring those realized benefits that are coming from, connecting these different types of ecological features and helping us understand how these hybrid engineered green stormwater infrastructure features might play into these other intact features. And are we actually realizing the habitat benefits we hope we're getting out of them?
Exactly. For anybody that's modeling in the room, maybe you've heard the adage that all models are wrong. Some models are useful. And I think your point, Lauren, is we're trying to ask more, and Rebecca, you were mentioning this too, we're asking more and more of these models to try to give us more information that maybe the models aren't built for yet. And that's a gap, right? That's what we've identified. We need to build these services in better. We need to, I do also think that there is a gap between what the models tell us and what we do on the landscape, and then what ends up in the resulting receiving water bodies. I think there is a disconnect there that we're maybe not missing or not understanding all the processes. The sum of the parts aren't getting to what we get as a result all the time. So I think there's I agree. I think there's a gap there and we have some work to do. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. I think that was an in-person. Let's take an online one and then we'll come with our last in-person one before we close.
What tools do you use to make that case for green infrastructure practices?
Ooh, the economic.
There's a few of them out there that we've used. I recently worked on a study, I think I mentioned it earlier, in the city of St. Paul with the Capital Region Watershed District, where we were looking at implementing regional green stormwater infrastructure within their jurisdiction. And the tool that we used for that scenario is we used a tool that quantifies triple bottom line and does a triple bottom line analysis. And the one that we chose in that particular case is put out by the Water Research Foundation. And so what we found with those types of tools, and we've used those previously with other clients, is that they can help connect back and help to tell the story and make the case for policymakers and decision makers to understand and put some quantification around benefits of not only the environmental benefits and kind of the traditional, stormwater models to say we remove this much total phosphorus, we remove this much TSS, and we're estimating it's going to cost this much. But it starts to move into trying to put numbers to what the community benefit is and some of those other kind of broader considerations in terms of, what's the potential impact of property values, for example. And they have some modules within there that tries to put value to that. What we found in that particular case is that where we saw the bulk of benefit in thinking about the implementation of GSI in that area was around what was termed recreational, but a lot of it was, again, kind of that pedestrian experience, like bringing some of those other benefits to the area that were looked for within this urban landscape. In that case, we did then coupled that with some stormwater models because we recognized that those maybe have some more strengths in computing kind of those traditional civil engineering values of, again, what's the flood benefit, what's the water quality benefit. So we use those types of more traditional tools for that, and then use the TBL tool to quantify those other secondary and tertiary benefits.
When I look at and have looked at the triple bottom line software that's available, there's kind of a gap there too. So we have the science-based models that can be always wrong, but they can, whether they're empirical or whether they're, process driven, there's a lot of science and a lot of years behind models, loss rate, just the triple bottom line ones they're almost not engineering enough. They aren't necessarily tailored. They don't have inputs for cold climate. So, Barr had to go and develop those to do the capital project that Stephanie was talking about. And it's actually, to me, it seems a little black boxy. I think it's great to have a tool for consistency. What I have used in lieu of pulling in that risk, it's more of like a risk management, you have practitioners coming in, not from civil engineering, but you have practitioners coming in to do this from a risk management perspective, almost like a financial risk management. So it's completely different sets of training, and that can be, I think, really valuable, but we haven't really well integrated those yet. So I think it takes a super talented practitioner with a lot of experience, Stephanie's experience, to be able to do those models, the triple bottom line models, and have them mean anything. And they're so easy to operate that, anyone could build a model, but it's not going to necessarily be valuable. So one of the things that I have used is, and I've used this since I started, is quantifying costs and benefits for decision makers. A really simple table and relative cost for each choice. So for every project that you're going to do, you have a certain number of choices that those decision makers, the city council, the watershed board, the county commissioners can make. And I really just, I'll have the number of dollar signs from 1 to 5, really, really, really simplified. Water quality benefit, number of stars, 1 to 5. And then I quantify what we don't know. Level of uncertainty. 5 is really high, 1 is really low. So, and you take those criteria, then you can do the natural resource habitat, you can do impact to property owners, and you really just do a relative ranking of these, and that comes out of that analysis. That's a very simple spreadsheet, and it doesn't necessarily even have to be, you're going to have your judgment as an engineer, so you can do the model. You can go back and do the stormwater models. You can go back and do, some of the other assessments, and then you distill it. It's a ton of work that just ends up as a spreadsheet. Those are things that I feel like the decision makers who are spending the money really value, and I think it's been really helpful to them. I just think as engineers and as scientists and practitioners, we need to be really careful about how we build those out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a good point. There are some tools out there, and as Andy alluded to, you know, it's kind of the old modeling adage too of garbage in, garbage out. So you gotta be really thoughtful and careful about how you apply those. And so that is something just to go into those eyes wide open, and thinking about the type of inputs that you put in and the assumptions that go into them. We have found that they can be really useful. They have helped a lot of our clients kind of think through that and talk through it with their decision makers, connect it back to some of their overarching plans and policies. We've found that they can help to bring the case to non-stormwater people, so folks who are looking at it and kind of have this, a desire to do the right thing to bring resiliency into their community, but also to think about the dollars and cents of, well, how do I think about the benefit of maybe reducing some heat island impact, and what's the financial consideration associated with that versus another $1 million in investment and maintenance long term? How do I think about those things? So we found that these tools can be one way to help with that. And what we will often do with them is we will set them up, and we will do kind of a status quo or baseline analysis to say, you know, it's just a comparison. So if you were to just move forward with standard gray infrastructure, meet the requirements, kind of just status quo of what you would have to do, versus maybe taking a more kind of that next level and doing something, implementing multi-functional GSI. Let's think about that as scenario 2, and then we can kind of put those next to each other. So that helps to reduce some of that uncertainty because it's working off of the same baseline assumptions. We could argue about if the assumptions are correct or not, but we know that at least we've got two numbers that we can compare to each other using two different approaches to designing and implementing stormwater infrastructure.
Those are valuable tools, and I rely on our consultant experts on our project teams to calculate those for us to ensure that I'm not using the garbage in data when we're making those calculations.
Well, and you know, another modeling adage is the model doesn't know the right answer. It doesn't know what's real. It doesn't know what is possible or not possible or feasible or practical. So that's our jobs, is that interpretation phase. And so modeling can be a big challenge. So then we'll do our key takeaway question, the closing seminar question. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give your key takeaways. You can highlight something that we've talked about that you want to reiterate and make sure that our audience keeps at the front of their minds. If there was something we didn't get to talk about that you thought was really important to this conversation, you could highlight that as we close. Or anything else that you would like to end our conversation with. So again, I'm going to start at the far end, just like we introduced everyone. Jamison, take it away. What are your key takeaways?
For me, one word comes to mind, and that's connectivity. And it's in really a variety of forms, whether it's connecting with communities, connecting with partners, connecting with watershed districts, with local governments, with diverse communities, or connecting to floodplain, connecting to longitudinal connection, connecting to groundwater. So, you know, that's kind of one of the key takeaways for me is the importance of doing that, making those connections. And I think one thing that we always rely on when we're developing these types of projects is we need diverse project teams, so people with diverse expertise, so that we can bring in. I'm not a Mississippi River Corridor flyway expert, so we bring somebody with that expertise, say on non-game animals, or if it's for snake hibernaculums, things like that. Where are those best designed on the landscape? So we make sure that we have those diverse voices that bring out the best projects and the greatest number of mutual benefits that we can establish with these projects that not only provide better projects, but also are able to leverage diverse funding sources as well.
Very good. Jamison, thank you. Stephanie, what would be your key takeaways today?
I think I'll go back to, I think it was maybe on one of Lauren's final slides, and the way she phrased it was the right solution at the right location, or something along those lines. I think that that's really important. is to be thoughtful about the types of practices that we're putting in, be thoughtful about, again, in my world as a consultant, working with my clients to say, what's practical for you? What do you have the ability to maintain? What are the goals that you're trying to meet? What is your community looking for? And so I think those are key takeaways, and just something that I would stress from kind of the work that we're doing right now is trying to get those answers up front and being thoughtful about what we're implementing so that we can be successful and hopefully keep monitoring these things long term and see that they're actually meeting and providing the benefits that they were intended when we put them in the first place.
That's great. Thank you, Stephanie. Rebecca, your key takeaways today.
Simplicity and visibility. The work that Lauren's doing, the work that SAFL is doing, having these data points help us to better quantify things so that they can be more visible to the population. Civil infrastructure and public health should be invisible when they're functioning well. The only time we get calls are when there are problems. So that makes it difficult for us to make funding cases. But I think the work that was discussed here today is very helpful in helping people understand, oh, this is a direct benefit to me. This makes me, the heat island work, shade is awesome. I know that the increasing temperatures that we've had here in Minneapolis have made, shade tree, I think people will start to appreciate it more. So it's that simplicity of how we commute and communicate these benefits, and then also raising the visibility of the water and natural resources. So not necessarily having all the pipes underground where people don't see it, but having those rain gardens and having those spaces that are beautiful. I think that hopefully will be a positive feedback loop that increases awareness and increases funding, hopefully, so we have adequate funding for stormwater.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Rebecca. Lauren, you get the first word and the last word. So what are your key takeaways today?
These are all excellent ones. I'd just say, I think we want to be careful not to try to do all the things in every project. We need to prioritize, but we also shouldn't be designing for a single function. What matters to that community? What are those one or two other bonus benefits we can get in there? We have to do stormwater management for our regulations, so why not add something in without extra cost, but we're getting extra benefit. But on the flip side, we need to build in some new recreation features. Can we get some bonus stormwater benefit there to help us build more and more resilience into our system, beyond just the things that we're absolutely required to do?
That's excellent. So that will close out this month's Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series. I want to thank our panelists and our keynote speaker for providing the content today. I want to thank you, the audience, both in person and online, for joining us. I encourage you to check out our schedule for future seminar series events. If you've missed past events, all of them are recorded and they are on our YouTube channel, so you can check those out. I encourage you to do so because there is a wealth of information there. So thank you so much for joining us today. I hope to see you at a future Stormwater seminar, and help me thank our speaker and panelists.